In the darkest chapters of Israel's saga, a time when kings bowed low to idols and the very earth yearned for righteousness, the Almighty brought forth a man of unparalleled zeal, Elijah the Tishbite. His name alone would echo through palaces and rend the heavens. This is the chronicle of the prophet who commanded drought, summoned celestial fire, and walked so intimately with God that death itself could not claim him. From his confrontations with wicked monarchs to his miraculous raising of the dead. From his moments of despairing flight to his reception of God's tenderest whisper, witness the extraordinary odyssey of the man who never knew death, taken alive in a fiery chariot. His story will set your faith ablaze and remind you that God still speaks to those who dare to listen. Are you prepared to walk through fire? In the northern kingdom of Israel, King Ahab occupied the throne, yet his heart had already surrendered to wickedness. The pivotal moment arrived when he chose Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, as his wife. This was no mere political maneuver. It was spiritual annihilation for an entire nation. 1 Kings 16 verse 31 captures the sheer gravity of this fateful decision. And it came to pass, as if it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. So he went and served Baal and worshipped him. Scripture depicts Ahab's adherence to Jeroboam's sins as insignificant, not rebellious enough to satisfy his appetite. He craved a deeper plunge into the abyss. Jezebel introduced the worship of Baal, a Canaanite fertility deity believed by her people to control rain, storms, and harvests. For a nation dependent on agriculture like Israel, this held immense allure. Why place trust in an unseen God when you could worship one who supposedly guaranteed bountiful crops? Ahab didn't simply tolerate his wife's religion. He wholeheartedly embraced it, forsaking the God of his ancestors. This foreign princess achieved what no invading army could. She conquered Israel's king from within the walls of his own palace. The corruption that began in the royal bedchamber quickly spread throughout the kingdom like a virulent plague. Ahab wasn't content with private Baal worship in some hidden corner of his palace. He elevated it to the official religion of Israel. 1 Kings 16 verse 32 chronicles his brazen actions. Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. He erected a full-fledged temple dedicated to this false god right in Israel's capital city, in plain sight for all to see. This was not done in secret or with shame, but with pride and ceremony. Ahab's rebellion plunged even further into darkness. Verse 33 continues, Ahab made a wooden image. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. The wooden image was an Asherah pole, representing Baal's supposed female consort. These symbols of fertility worship were associated with the most degrading and immoral practices imaginable. Consider the scripture's implications. Ahab surpassed the wickedness of every king before him combined. That's a powerful statement, given Israel's long history of deplorable rulers. The people, emboldened by their king's example and intimidated by his power, eagerly embraced this new religion. After all, if the king proclaimed Baal's power and ability to bless them, who were they to argue? The worship of the true God faded into distant memory as altars to Baal sprang up across the land like weeds after a storm. But God had not forsaken Israel, and he certainly wouldn't allow Baal's false claims to go unchallenged. In the rugged wilderness of Gilead, beyond the Jordan River, lived a man whose very name declared unwavering allegiance to the true God. Elijah the Tishbite, whose name signifies "My God is the Lord," was about to become God's chosen instrument to combat Israel's spiritual rebellion. The Bible offers no details about Elijah's family, education, or how he initially became a prophet. What we do know is that God had been preparing him for this precise moment in Israel's history. Elijah wasn't from the sophisticated cities of Jerusalem or Samaria. He had no ties to the royal court or the corrupt religious establishment. He was a humble man from the countryside, likely clad in coarse homespun clothing, living a simple, arduous life in the wilderness. His hands were probably rough from outdoor labor, his skin tanned by the sun and wind. But God often selects the most unlikely individuals for his most significant works. Moses was a fugitive shepherd when God called him. David was merely a teenage shepherd boy when Samuel anointed him. And now Elijah, a rural prophet from the remote hills of Gilead, would stand fearlessly against the most powerful and wicked king and queen in Israel's history. His calling wasn't heralded with royal fanfare or religious ceremony. It would be validated through his bold, unwavering obedience to God's word. Without warning, without requesting a formal audience or observing court protocols, Elijah suddenly appeared before King Ahab in his palace. Imagine the scene. This wild-looking prophet from the wilderness, still dusty from his journey, abruptly standing before Israel's most powerful king, bearing a message that would shake the nation to its core. The court officials must have been stunned by this breach of protocol. 1 Kings 17 verse 1 captures this utterly dramatic confrontation. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word." Note carefully Elijah's opening declaration, "As the Lord God of Israel lives." He was making it unequivocally clear which God he served, boldly distinguishing the true, living God of Israel from the lifeless, powerless idol called Baal. Then came the shocking, earth-shattering announcement that would change everything. No rain, not even morning dew, would fall on Israel except at Elijah's command. This was a direct, unmistakable challenge to Baal's supposed control over weather and fertility. If Baal truly controlled the rains and storms, as his worshippers claimed, let him prove it by bringing rain despite God's judgment. Through this drought, Elijah was essentially declaring spiritual warfare on the false god. The prophet stood fearlessly before the kingdom's most powerful and dangerous man, plainly stating that his God was utterly powerless and his nation would suffer until they returned to the one true God. Having delivered such a bold and threatening message to the king, Elijah needed to vanish immediately and completely. Ahab, and especially the vengeful Queen Jezebel, would undoubtedly seek his capture and execution for his pronouncements against their kingdom and their God. But God had already prepared the next step in his perfect plan. 1 Kings 17 verses 2-3 reveals God's specific instructions to his faithful servant. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Get away from here and turn eastward, and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan." God instructed Elijah to journey east, back toward his familiar homeland of Gilead, to a small, secluded stream called Cherith. This brook emptied into the mighty Jordan River, providing a perfectly hidden refuge far from the king's searching soldiers and spies. The location was ideal, remote enough to be safe, yet with access to fresh water for drinking. God wasn't only shielding Elijah from human enemies seeking to kill him, he was strategically positioning his prophet for the next crucial phase of his unfolding plan. The brook Cherith would become Elijah's private sanctuary, a peaceful place where he could patiently await and witness God's righteous judgment unfold across the rebellious land of Israel. Here, far from the chaos, danger, and corruption of the royal court, God would care for his faithful servant in the most miraculous and unexpected way imaginable. At the secluded brook Cherith, God revealed his provision plan to Elijah, a plan unlike any ever conceived in human history. 1 Kings 17 verse 4 records God's astonishing promise. "And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Ravens. Of all the creatures in God's creation he could have chosen to provide Elijah's food, he deliberately selected these large, black scavenger birds, considered ceremonially unclean according to strict Jewish law. These were not gentle doves or majestic eagles, but ravens, birds that typically scavenged for dead animals and garbage. Yet, God commanded them to serve his prophet with the dedication of royal servants. Every morning and every evening, without fail, these unlikely winged waiters arrived punctually at Elijah's riverside camp with his meals perfectly prepared. 1 Kings 17 verse 6 confirms this daily miracle that persisted month after month. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Picture this incredible scene in your mind. While all of Israel began to suffer the harsh consequences of the drought Elijah had proclaimed, God's faithful prophet lived peacefully and safely by a flowing stream, fed twice daily by a supernatural catering service that never missed a delivery. The ravens never faltered, faithfully arriving every morning and evening, carrying fresh bread and meat in their strong beaks. Where did they obtain this food? The Bible doesn't say, but God had clearly made supernatural provision through this miracle. God was demonstrating to Elijah, in the most practical way possible, that he could provide abundantly through the most unexpected and improbable means. If the Creator could command wild ravens to become faithful servants, there was absolutely nothing he couldn't accomplish for those who trusted him completely. Month after long month, the drought continued precisely as Elijah had boldly declared before King Ahab. The merciless sun beat down relentlessly on Israel's once fertile land. Crops withered and died in the fields. Wells that had provided water for generations went completely dry. Rivers became dusty creek beds. Animals grew weak and began to perish from thirst and starvation. The terrible famine spread relentlessly throughout the entire kingdom, affecting rich and poor alike, city dwellers and farmers alike. Even Elijah's safe haven by the brook Cherith wasn't entirely immune to the effects of God's severe judgment. 1 Kings 17 verse 7 records the eventual outcome. And it happened after a while that the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. The same devastating drought that was punishing Israel for their shameful idol worship had finally reached even Elijah's remote hiding place. Day by day, the faithful prophet watched the water level steadily decline. The clear stream that had been his reliable lifeline for so many months was slowly but surely disappearing before his eyes. The rocks that had been covered with flowing water began to emerge. The brook diminished to a trickle, then to scattered pools, then vanished completely. But this wasn't a mistake or an unfortunate oversight in God's perfect plan. It was precisely timed for the next chapter of Elijah's remarkable story. God's timing is always perfect, even when we fail to comprehend it. When the brook finally ran completely dry, leaving not a single drop behind, Elijah didn't panic or fret about his next drink of water. Through months of miraculous provision by ravens and brook water, he had learned to trust God's perfect timing completely and without reservation. Just as the very last drops of water vanished completely from the brook Cherith, leaving only dry stones and sand, God spoke to his faithful prophet once more, delivering surprising new instructions for the next phase of his journey. 1 Kings 17 verses 8 to 9 reveals God's unexpected next step. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." This divine command was utterly shocking and surprising on multiple levels, undoubtedly astounding even Elijah. First, God was sending his prophet to Zarephath, a small coastal town in Sidon, none other than Queen Jezebel's homeland. This was akin to sending him directly into enemy territory, to the very region where Baal worship had originated and was strongest. It would be the last place anyone would expect to find a Hebrew prophet in hiding. Second, and equally astonishing, God was directing him to depend on a widow for his provision and protection. In the ancient world, widows were typically among the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, usually relying on the charity and kindness of others for their basic survival, rather than possessing extra resources to share with strangers. How could a poor widow in a drought-stricken foreign land possibly provide for anyone else when she was likely struggling to feed herself? But God's ways are always infinitely higher and wiser than human understanding or logic. He was about to demonstrate his unlimited power and faithful provision through the simple faith of a foreign woman, clearly showing that his love, care, and miraculous provision extend far beyond the borders of Israel to anyone, anywhere, who trusts in him with all their heart. When Elijah arrived at the gates of Zarephath, weary and thirsty from his long journey, he saw exactly what God had promised: a widow gathering sticks. But she appeared desperately poor, wearing the simple clothes of someone with almost nothing left. Elijah called out to her with a straightforward request. 1 Kings 17 verse 10 tells us what transpired. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Please bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink." The woman didn't refuse, but as she turned to fetch the water, Elijah made another request that must have startled her. Verse 11 continues, "And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, "Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." Her response revealed the true extent of her desperation. In verse 12, she explained her heartbreaking reality. So she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." She was preparing what she believed would be her final meal for herself and her son. After that, they expected to starve to death. But Elijah had an incredible message from God. Verse 13 to 14 records his amazing promise. And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear, go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." Single quote. The woman faced a choice: trust the stranger's God, or prepare for death. She chose faith. Verse 15 to 16 reveals what happened next. So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Elijah. Every day she scooped flour from the bin, expecting it to be empty, but there was always enough. Every day she poured oil from the jar, certain it would run out, but it never did. God had transformed her final meal into an endless supply that fed 3 people for months. Life in the widow's house had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Each day brought the miracle of never-ending flour and oil, and Elijah had become like family to them. But then tragedy struck without warning. The widow's son, the light of her life and her only child, fell ill. Day by day, his condition worsened until, finally, the worst possible thing happened. 1 Kings 17 verse 17 describes this heartbreaking moment. Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. The boy was dead. Can you imagine the widow's pain and confusion? God had miraculously provided food for them every single day. So why would he allow her precious son to die? In her grief and anger, she turned on Elijah with words that cut deep. Verse 18 records her anguished cry. So she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance, and to kill my son?" She believed that somehow Elijah's presence had drawn God's attention to her sins, and now her son was dead as punishment. The joy and trust they had built over months of miraculous provision shattered in an instant. But Elijah didn't argue with her or attempt to explain. Instead, he acted with gentle compassion. Verse 19 tells us, "And he said to her, 'Give me your son.' So he took him out of her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his own bed. Elijah took the lifeless body of the boy upstairs to his own room, away from the mother's agonizing cries. There, alone with the dead child, Elijah poured out his own confused and desperate heart to God. In the quiet of the upper room, Elijah faced his own crisis of faith. He had witnessed God provide food miraculously every day, but now this innocent child was dead. Why would God permit such a thing? But instead of surrendering, Elijah did what he knew best. He prayed with all his might. 1 Kings 17 verse 20 shows us his honest, desperate prayer. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son?" Elijah wasn't afraid to question God or express his confusion. He laid the child on his bed and then did something unprecedented in human history before this moment. Verse 21 describes his dramatic action. "And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times, and cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him.' 3 times Elijah stretched his full body over the dead boy, pleading with God to restore his life. This wasn't a quiet, polite prayer. It was desperate, passionate intercession for a miracle that seemed impossible. And then the impossible happened. Verse 22 records the first resurrection in Scripture. "Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, And the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. The boy's eyes opened. His chest began to rise and fall with breath. Life returned to his small body through the power of the God of Israel. Elijah's joy must have been overwhelming as he picked up the living child and carried him downstairs to his mother. Verse 23 captures this moment of pure joy. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house, and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." The widow's response reveals how this miracle transformed everything she believed about God and his prophet. Verse 24 records her declaration. Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." Through this resurrection, the first ever recorded, God had proven his power over death itself. For 3 long years, the drought continued exactly as Elijah had proclaimed. The land of Israel suffered terribly. Crops failed, animals died, and people began to starve. King Ahab had searched everywhere for the prophet who had brought this judgment upon his kingdom. But Elijah had remained safely hidden, first at the brook Cherith and then in Zarephath. But now God's timing was perfect for the next phase of his plan. 1 Kings 18 verse 1 tells us when God decided to end the drought. And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, "Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth." After 3 years of hiding, God commanded Elijah to show himself to the very king who wanted him dead. This took incredible courage, but Elijah obeyed immediately. The famine had become so severe that even the royal palace was affected. Verse 2 explains, "So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab, and there was a severe famine in Samaria. King Ahab had dispatched his palace manager, Obadiah, to search for grass to keep the royal horses and mules alive. But Obadiah was secretly a believer who had hidden 100 prophets of God when Jezebel was trying to kill them all. When Obadiah encountered Elijah on the road, he could hardly believe his eyes." Verses 7 to 8 describe their meeting. Now as Obadiah was on his way, suddenly Elijah met him, and he recognized him and fell on his face and said, "Is that you, my lord Elijah?" And he answered him, "It is I. Go, tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah was terrified that if he told Ahab where Elijah was, the prophet might vanish again, and Ahab would kill the messenger. But Elijah assured him that he would not hide this time. When Ahab finally came face to face with the prophet who had caused 3 years of suffering, his greeting was full of anger and blame. Verse 17 records the king's accusation. Then it happened, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" But Elijah fearlessly shifted the blame back where it belonged. Verse 18 shows his bold response. And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals." Now that Elijah had confronted King Ahab directly, it was time for the ultimate showdown between the true God and the false god Baal. Elijah proposed a public contest that would settle the question once and for all. 1 Kings 18 verse 19 records his dramatic challenge. "Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." This wasn't going to be a private religious debate. Elijah wanted all of Israel to witness this showdown. Mount Carmel was the perfect location, a high mountain where everyone could see what transpired. When the people gathered, Elijah addressed them with words that cut straight to the heart of their spiritual confusion. Verse 21 captures his powerful challenge. "And Elijah came to all the people and said, 'How long will you falter between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him.' Yet, not a single person uttered a response. The people had been attempting to straddle the fence, to worship both God and Baal simultaneously, but Elijah was setting the record straight. This was simply not possible. They had to choose definitively one or the other. Then, Elijah laid out the ground rules for a contest, a showdown that would definitively prove which deity was the real deal. Verses 23 and 24 detail his proposition. "Therefore," he declared, "let them give us 2 bulls. Let them pick one for themselves, cut it up, and lay it on the wood, but don't set it on fire. I'll prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood, and I won't light it either. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I'll call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers with fire, that's the real God. The test was straightforward and equitable. Both sides would meticulously prepare a sacrifice, but neither would ignite the fire. The God who unleashed fire from the heavens to consume the offering would undeniably prove himself to be the true God. The people were captivated by this idea, seeing it as a way to resolve the matter once and for all, leaving no room for doubt. Verse 24 seals their agreement. So all the people answered and said, "That's a great idea." Given the overwhelming odds, 450 prophets of Baal versus a lone prophet of the true God, Elijah, with characteristic grace, allowed them to proceed first. The 450 prophets of Baal meticulously prepared their sacrifice, brimming with confidence as they began to implore their God. They were absolutely certain that Baal, who supposedly held dominion over lightning and storms, would effortlessly summon fire to incinerate their offering. 1 Kings 18 verse 26 vividly depicts their mourning endeavors. So they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning even till noon, saying, "O Baal, hear us." But there was no response, not a single peep. No one answered. Then they began leaping and dancing around the altar they had constructed. Hour after hour, they fervently cried out to Baal, but absolutely nothing happened. No fire descended, no voice responded, no sign materialized. Their frantic dancing around the altar grew increasingly desperate as time wore on. By noon, Elijah, seizing the moment with his sharp wit, decided to ratchet up the pressure. Verse 27 captures his mocking suggestions perfectly. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Shout louder. After all, he's a god. Maybe he's deep in thought, or perhaps he's indisposed, or even on a trip. Or maybe he's just catching some Z's and needs a wake-up call." Elijah was essentially implying that perhaps Baal was simply too preoccupied to answer. Or perhaps he was enjoying a midday nap and needed to be roused from his slumber. This only fueled the false prophets to even more desperate acts. Verse 28 paints a picture of their extreme behavior. So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, until the blood gushed out on them. They slashed their own bodies with sharp weapons, believing that their blood and pain would somehow grab Baal's attention. All afternoon, they continued this gruesome spectacle, becoming increasingly frantic in their efforts. Verse 29 tells us just how long this went on. And when midday was past, they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. From morning until evening, for nearly 12 grueling hours, they had cried, danced, cut themselves, and pleaded with their God to respond. But Baal remained completely silent because, quite simply, Baal was not real. The altar remained cold and empty. The sacrifice remained unburned. And the 450 prophets had inadvertently proven that their God was utterly powerless. As evening approached, and the prophets of Baal finally succumbed to exhaustion and defeat, it was Elijah's turn to call upon his God. But first he had some preparatory work to do. The old altar of the Lord on Mount Carmel had fallen into disrepair during the years of Baal worship. So Elijah needed to rebuild it properly. 1 Kings 18 verse 30 recounts how he began. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. Elijah didn't just haphazardly throw together a makeshift altar. He meticulously built it according to God's instructions, imbuing it with profound symbolic meaning. Verse 31 elucidates his careful approach. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." Each stone represented one of the 12 tribes of Israel, signifying that this God belonged to all of Israel, not just a select few. Verse 32 describes his thorough preparation. Then with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. The trench encircling the altar would play a pivotal role in the events that were about to unfold. Next, Elijah arranged the wood and meticulously placed the butchered bull on top, mirroring the actions of the prophets of Baal. But then, he did something that appeared to sabotage his own efforts. Verse 33 records his surprising command. And he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood and said, "Fill 4 water pots with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood." Water on a sacrifice that was supposed to ignite? This seemed utterly insane, but Elijah wasn't finished yet. Verse 34 reveals just how thoroughly he saturated everything. Then he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. 3 times they drenched the sacrifice and the wood with water until everything was completely saturated. Verse 35 details the outcome. So the water ran all around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. The altar was practically drowning in water, rendering it humanly impossible for any fire to ignite. But Elijah served a God who specialized in accomplishing the seemingly impossible. With the altar meticulously prepared and thoroughly soaked with water, Elijah stepped forward to offer his prayer. This was nothing like the frantic shouting and dancing of Baal's prophets. This was a calm, confident prayer directed to the God who actually existed. 1 Kings 18 verses 36 to 37 records Elijah's simple yet powerful prayer. And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again." Elijah's prayer was concise, respectful, and focused on God's glory rather than his own reputation. He wanted everyone to recognize that the true God of Israel was still very much alive and powerful. The response was instantaneous and spectacular. Verse 38 vividly describes what happened next. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. This wasn't just a small flame that ignited the sacrifice. This was an explosion of fire so immense and powerful that it consumed everything. The meat, the wood, the 12 stones of the altar, even the dust surrounding it, and all the water in the trench. Nothing remained but a clean, scorched patch on the mountainside. The people's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Verse 39 captures their response. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." After witnessing Baal's prophets fail for 12 long hours, they had now seen the true God answer in mere seconds with power that defied imagination. The contest was unequivocally over. The question had been definitively settled, and the people knew without a shadow of a doubt which God was real. There was no more confusion, no more attempting to worship both God and Baal. The fire from heaven had proven, once and for all, that the Lord alone is God. After the dramatic fire from heaven had unequivocally demonstrated God's power, Elijah knew precisely what needed to happen next. The 450 false prophets of Baal, who had led Israel astray into idolatry, could not be allowed to escape and continue their deception. With the people now fully convinced that the Lord alone was God, Elijah acted swiftly and decisively. 1 Kings 18 verse 40 records his immediate command. And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. The brook Kishon was a stream that flowed down from Mount Carmel toward the Mediterranean Sea, winding through the valley below the mountain where this monumental contest had taken place. This wasn't a decision Elijah made in a fit of anger or a thirst for revenge. It was divine judgment, mandated by God through the law of Moses centuries earlier. These false prophets had led an entire nation away from the true God and into the worship of demons masquerading as fertility gods. They had corrupted Israel's children, propagated lies about the very nature of God, and induced countless people to sin against their Creator through immoral religious practices. The people, still awestruck and shaken by the incredible fire they had just witnessed consuming the sacrifice, obeyed Elijah's command without question or hesitation. They seized all 450 prophets, who just hours before had been slashing themselves with knives and desperately crying out to their silent, powerless God. These men, who had enjoyed a life of luxury at Queen Jezebel's table, basking in royal protection and popular support, now found themselves prisoners of the very people they had deceived for so long. One by one, these deceivers, who had poisoned Israel's faith with lies and plunged families into spiritual darkness, were led down to the brook and executed in accordance with God's righteous law. The waters of the Kishon ran red that day as divine justice was finally served after years of patient endurance. This wasn't an act of cruelty or unnecessary violence. It was the essential spiritual cleansing that God required before he would send rain upon the land once more. The spiritual cancer that had infected Israel for so many years was finally being eradicated completely and permanently. Not a single one of the false prophets escaped to continue their evil work in some other place. The land was being purified from the contamination of false worship, and the path was being cleared for God's blessing to return to his covenant people. When the last false prophet was dead, and their deceitful voices were silenced forever, the great spiritual battle was finally over. Baal's representatives in Israel had been utterly defeated, and the true God had demonstrated his absolute supremacy over all false gods and their servants. With the false prophets eliminated and God's honor fully restored before all the people, it was time for the devastating drought to come to an end, precisely as God had promised. Elijah climbed back up Mount Carmel with his faithful servant to pray earnestly for the rain that would heal the parched land and restore life to Israel. 1 Kings 18 verse 41 reveals just how completely confident Elijah was in God's unwavering promise. Then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." Even though the sky above them was still perfectly clear, without so much as a single cloud on the horizon, Elijah could already hear the approaching rain in his spirit because God had promised that it would come. He instructed King Ahab to go and celebrate with food and drink because the long drought was about to end in a dramatic fashion. But Elijah himself went to the very summit of the mountain to pray with intense focus and unwavering determination. Verse 42 describes his humble posture of earnest intercession. So Ahab went up to eat and drink. Then Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. Then he bowed down on the ground and put his face between his knees. This was the posture of someone praying with complete concentration and desperate earnestness, shutting out all distractions to focus entirely on seeking God's face. Elijah wasn't casually requesting rain as if it were a minor favor. He was earnestly pleading with God for the fulfillment of his promise to end the judgment and restore blessing. Then, Elijah sent his servant to look toward the western sea while he continued praying with unwavering persistence. Verse 43 tells us what transpired during this time of patient waiting and said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And 7 times he said, "Go again." 6 times, the faithful servant climbed to the highest point to scan the horizon over the Mediterranean Sea. And 6 times, he returned with the disappointing report of seeing nothing but clear blue sky stretching endlessly to the horizon. But Elijah continued praying fervently and kept sending him back to look again. He knew that God's promise was absolutely true and reliable, even when he couldn't yet see any physical evidence of its fulfillment. His faith wasn't based on what his eyes could see but on what God had spoken. Finally, on the 7th try, something small but significant appeared. Verse 44 records the breakthrough moment that changed everything. Then it came to pass the 7th time that he said, "There is a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising out of the sea." And so he said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot, and go down before the rain stops you." After 3.5 years of perfectly clear skies, day after day, a tiny cloud finally materialized on the distant horizon. It was no bigger than a person's hand when held up against the sky. But Elijah knew with absolute certainty that this was the beginning of God's powerful answer to his prayer. He immediately sent urgent word to King Ahab to hurry home to his palace, before the impending storm made travel impossible on the muddy roads. The news of what had happened on Mount Carmel reached Queen Jezebel very quickly through her network of spies and informants, and her reaction was precisely what one might expect from someone whose entire religious system had just been publicly destroyed and humiliated. When she received the detailed report that the fire of God had consumed the sacrifice while her prophets had failed completely, and that all 450 of her carefully chosen prophets had been killed at the brook Kishon, she was consumed by murderous rage and an uncontrollable desire for revenge. The very next morning after this great victory for God's truth, Jezebel sent a threatening message to Elijah that would change everything and plunge the victorious prophet into the darkest period of his entire life. 1 Kings 19 verses 1-2 records her deadly promise. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Jezebel was making a solemn oath, swearing by her false gods that within exactly 24 hours, Elijah would be dead, just like every one of her prophets who had perished at the brook. This wasn't an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Jezebel possessed the political power, the financial resources, and the ruthless determination to carry out her promise of death. She had already successfully murdered many of God's prophets before this time, systematically hunting them down and eliminating them from Israel, and she wouldn't hesitate for even a moment to kill the one who had publicly humiliated her and destroyed her religious influence forever. When Elijah received this chilling message from the queen's personal messenger, something completely unexpected happened, revealing just how human even the greatest prophets can be. The same man who had fearlessly confronted King Ahab in his own palace, challenged 450 false prophets before thousands of witnesses, and confidently summoned fire from heaven, suddenly became overwhelmed with fear and panic. Verse 3 reveals his shocking response. And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. The great prophet, who had demonstrated such incredible courage and faith just one day before, was now running desperately for his life, like a hunted criminal. He journeyed all the way south to Beersheba, which was situated at the very southern border of Judah, as far away from Jezebel's murderous reach as he could possibly get while still remaining within the territory of God's people. There, he made the difficult decision to leave his faithful servant behind, perhaps to shield the young man from whatever terrible fate might be awaiting him, or perhaps because he needed to confront his fears and despair completely alone. From Beersheba, Elijah continued his desperate flight alone into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Negev desert. Leaving behind the last vestiges of civilization and human comfort, he was no longer thinking clearly or rationally about his situation. He was a man running blindly from his overwhelming fears, drowning in complete emotional and spiritual exhaustion. After walking for an entire day deeper into the barren desert, where no one could possibly find him or follow him, he finally collapsed in utter exhaustion under a small, scraggly broom tree, the only sliver of shade he could find in that desolate, sun-baked wasteland. 1 Kings 19 verse 4 captures the devastating depth of his despair and hopelessness. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die and said, "It is enough now, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This was the very same man who had just witnessed and participated in the most astonishing display of God's power seen in generations. Yet now, he was begging God to end his life because he couldn't bear to continue living. Elijah felt like a complete and utter failure in every way that mattered. He had desperately hoped that the incredible victory on Mount Carmel would turn the entire nation back to God permanently and end the spiritual war once and for all. But Jezebel's immediate threat made it abundantly clear that the battle was far from over, and that evil still wielded tremendous power. One wicked woman's threatening message had completely shattered all his confidence, leaving him feeling utterly hopeless, defeated, and worthless. He was physically exhausted from his long journey through difficult terrain, emotionally drained from the intense spiritual confrontation with Baal's prophets, and spiritually discouraged by the painful realization that his great victory hadn't changed everything he had hoped and prayed it would change. In his deep depression, Elijah couldn't see past his immediate circumstances to remember God's faithfulness in the past or his promises for the future. He felt completely alone in the world, abandoned by God and man, and worthless as a servant of the Most High. The great prophet, who had been used so mightily by God, now lay under a scraggly desert bush, earnestly asking God to end his life because he could no longer bear the emotional and spiritual burden. He was convinced that he had failed completely in his mission, and that he was no better than the previous generations of God's servants, who had also struggled against evil and died without witnessing the complete victory they had longed for. But God didn't abandon his discouraged and exhausted servant alone in the wilderness to die of despair and dehydration. While Elijah slept the deep sleep of complete physical and emotional exhaustion under the sparse shade of the broom tree, God sent supernatural help in the form of an angel, dispatched on a special mission of mercy and restoration. 1 Kings 19 verse 5 tells us what happened during this divine intervention. Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him, and said to him, "Arise and eat." The touch was gentle yet firm, and the voice was kind but urgent, awakening the prophet from his exhausted slumber with words of care rather than rebuke. When Elijah opened his weary eyes, he discovered that God had provided exactly what he needed most in his current condition. Verse 6 describes the miraculous provision that appeared beside him. Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel had prepared fresh bread, still warm from baking on hot coals, and cool, refreshing water in a jar for the desperately thirsty prophet. This wasn't just ordinary food that might be found in the desert. It was heaven's special provision, prepared specifically for God's beloved but struggling servant. The bread was perfectly baked, nourishing and satisfying, and the water was pure and refreshing to his parched throat. Elijah ate and drank gratefully, his body beginning to recover from the dehydration and hunger, then went back to sleep, still emotionally and spiritually exhausted from his ordeal, and not yet ready to face his future. But the angel's ministry wasn't finished after this first meal. Verse 7 reveals the angel's continued patient care. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time, and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." The angel knew something important that Elijah didn't yet understand. He was about to embark on a long, difficult journey that would require supernatural physical strength and endurance beyond normal human capacity. The food God was providing wasn't just for his immediate hunger and thirst, but for the extended trip that lay ahead of him. Verse 8 reveals the absolutely amazing power of this heavenly meal. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. 40 days and 40 nights without eating again. This was the same significant length of time that Moses had spent on Mount Sinai receiving the law from God, and the same period that Jesus would later fast in the wilderness before beginning his public ministry. The food that the angel prepared and served gave Elijah supernatural strength and endurance to travel for more than a month without needing to eat again. For 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah journeyed steadily through the harsh wilderness, sustained only by the supernatural food the angel had provided in his time of desperate need. His destination was Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, the same sacred mountain where God had given Moses the 10 Commandments and revealed his glory to the people of Israel hundreds of years earlier. This was one of the most holy and significant places on earth, where God had repeatedly revealed himself to his people in dramatic and life-changing ways throughout their history. 1 Kings 19 verse 8 tells us about his arrival at this sacred destination. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. When Elijah finally reached this towering, imposing mountain after his arduous journey, he was drawn by instinct to a specific place that would provide both shelter from the elements and the solitude what God had in store was the reason Elijah had to be where he was. Verse 9 tells us where Elijah went and what transpired there. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God's query wasn't due to ignorance of Elijah's location or motivation for seeking refuge in such a desolate place. God is all-knowing and is completely aware of our circumstances and the feelings in our hearts, even before we utter a single word. This was a loving and gentle way for God to prompt Elijah to carefully and honestly evaluate his own heart and motives. What was the real reason he had abandoned his calling and responsibilities? What was he truly hoping to find by isolating himself on this mountain, so far removed from his home? God desired for his discouraged and confused prophet to engage in deep reflection about his situation, his emotions, his fears, and his relationship with his Creator. The cave where Elijah sought refuge for the night may very well have been the same crevice in the rock where God had concealed Moses when his magnificent glory passed by in all its awe-inspiring splendor. Throughout the ages, this mountain served as a place where God consistently met with his chosen servants during times of crisis, transition, and spiritual renewal. Abraham demonstrated his unwavering obedience to God's command by willingly offering his beloved son Isaac as a sacrifice on this very mountain. It was here that Moses received the law and witnessed God's glory in a way that forever transformed him. Now Elijah, feeling like a complete failure and ready to completely give up on his calling, had journeyed to this same sacred location, seeking answers, solace, and perhaps a renewed understanding of his purpose. The mountain of God was about to become the place where Elijah's shattered faith would be restored, and his understanding of God's character would be profoundly deepened in ways he never anticipated. When God gently inquired about Elijah's presence at Mount Horeb, the discouraged prophet unburdened his heart with absolute honesty, revealing his profound discouragement, overwhelming fear, and sense of utter failure. 1 Kings 19 verse 10 records his detailed lament. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life also." Elijah felt completely isolated and abandoned in his service to God, believing that he was the only faithful person remaining in all of Israel who still truly worshipped the Lord. He was under the impression that everyone else had forsaken God, that all the other prophets had been murdered, and that he himself was now being hunted like a dangerous criminal deserving of death. God's response was to impart to Elijah a profound lesson about his true nature and character, a lesson that would forever alter the prophet's understanding. Verse 11 records God's specific instruction. "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind." The wind was incredibly powerful and destructive, possessing sufficient force to literally shatter solid rocks on the mountainside into fragments, demonstrating the kind of raw, overwhelming power that could obliterate anything in its path. However, God was not revealed or present in this impressive demonstration of natural force. This must have greatly surprised Elijah, considering he had recently witnessed God working through dramatic displays of supernatural power, such as the consuming fire on Mount Carmel that had astonished everyone who witnessed it. But there was much more to come in this divine lesson. Verse 11 continues with the next demonstration. "And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake." The ground trembled violently beneath Elijah's feet with tremendous force, the kind of earthquake that could flatten cities and permanently alter the landscape. This was yet another display of awesome power that commanded attention and inspired fear. But once again, God was not manifesting himself through this impressive natural phenomenon. Then came something even more familiar and meaningful to Elijah's recent experience with God's power. Verse 12 tells us, "And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire." Fire. Just a few days prior, Elijah had witnessed God sending fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice on Mount Carmel in front of thousands of onlookers. Surely, God would reveal himself through fire once more, since this had been such a potent demonstration of his presence and power so recently. But no, even though fire appeared on the mountain, God was not in the fire this time either. Each of these three powerful displays, or the rock-shattering wind, the ground-shaking earthquake, and the consuming fire, represented precisely the kind of dramatic, overwhelming power that Elijah had become accustomed to seeing in God's mighty works. But God was patiently teaching him that his presence and his methods of working are not limited to spectacular displays of force that demand attention through their very magnitude. After the wind, earthquake, and fire had passed, leaving the mountain quiet and still, something completely different happened that would forever change how Elijah understood God's character and the ways he chooses to work in the world. 1 Kings 19 verse 12 describes this gentle, intimate moment. And after the fire a still small voice. Other translations describe this as a gentle whisper, a soft murmur, or a sound of gentle stillness that was almost too quiet to hear. This wasn't the booming thunder that had accompanied God's fearsome presence on this same mountain when he gave Moses the law amidst lightning and smoke. This wasn't the roaring fire that had dramatically consumed the sacrifice on Mount Carmel before thousands of amazed witnesses. This was something quiet, gentle, and deeply personal. The soft, tender whisper of God speaking intimately and lovingly to his beloved but wounded servant. Elijah's immediate response demonstrates that he recognized this gentle voice as the true authentic presence of God more clearly than all the dramatic displays that had preceded it. Verse 13 tells us, "So it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' Elijah quickly covered his face with his cloak out of deep reverence and holy fear, then stepped humbly to the mouth of the cave to meet personally with God. The question was exactly the same one God had asked before, but now it came in the context of this gentle personal encounter that spoke of love rather than judgment. God wasn't angry with Elijah for running away in fear or disappointed in his very human moment of weakness and discouragement. He was simply inviting his faithful servant to share openly and honestly what was really in his heart. His fears, his doubts, and his confusion. Elijah gave the same completely honest answer as before, repeating his deep feelings of loneliness, discouragement, and failure. But now God began to show him a different, more accurate perspective on his situation and his continuing calling as a prophet. Through this still small voice, God was gently teaching Elijah that his most powerful and lasting work often happens not through dramatic public displays that capture everyone's attention, but through quiet personal moments of relationship and intimate communication between him and his servants. The same God who could send consuming fire from heaven and split solid rocks with hurricane-force wind could also speak in whispers that touch the human heart more deeply and permanently than any earthquake or lightning. This gentle voice would soon give Elijah new instructions for his ministry, new hope for his future, and a completely new understanding of how God works in the world through faithful people who learn to listen carefully for his quiet guidance, rather than always expecting thunder and lightning to announce his presence. Through the gentle whisper at Mount Horeb, God began to reveal his continuing plan for Israel and Elijah's role in carrying it out. The discouraged prophet learned that his work wasn't finished and that God had specific tasks for him to complete before his ministry would end. 1 Kings 19 verses 15 to 16 records God's detailed commission. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place." God was giving Elijah 3 important assignments that would shape the future of the entire region. First, he was to anoint Hazael as the future king of Syria, Israel's neighboring enemy nation. This seems strange, but God had plans to use even foreign kings to accomplish his purposes. Second, he was to anoint Jehu as the future king of Israel, replacing the wicked dynasty of Ahab and Jezebel. Third, and most personally significant, he was to anoint Elisha as his own replacement, the prophet who would continue God's work when Elijah's time was over. God then explained how these 3 men would work together to complete his judgment on Israel's wickedness. Verse 17 reveals the divine strategy. "It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill." This wasn't about random violence, but about God's righteous judgment being carried out through different instruments. Those who escaped judgment from one source would face it from another until justice was complete. But God also gave Elijah encouraging news that answered his complaint about being alone. Verse 18 contains God's surprising revelation. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Elijah wasn't alone at all. God had kept 7,000 faithful people in Israel who had never worshipped Baal or participated in the idolatrous practices. These were people who had remained true to God even during the darkest times, though they had stayed hidden and quiet about their faith. This knowledge must have been incredibly encouraging to Elijah, showing him that God's work was much bigger than what he could see, and that faithful people existed throughout the land, even when they weren't visible or vocal about their beliefs. Armed with his new commission from God, Elijah left Mount Horeb and began the journey back toward Israel to carry out his assignments. The first task he accomplished was finding and calling Elisha, the man who would eventually take his place as God's prophet. 1 Kings 19 verse 19 tells us how this momentous meeting took place. So he departed from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. Elisha was working in the fields plowing with a team of 24 oxen arranged in 12 pairs, a sign that his family was wealthy and owned significant land. He was personally working with the 12th and final pair, showing that he wasn't afraid of hard physical labor despite his family's prosperity. When Elijah found him, the old prophet didn't give a long speech or explain everything about the calling. Instead, he simply threw his prophet's mantle over Elisha's shoulders, a symbolic act that immediately communicated what was happening. The mantle represented the prophet's authority and calling, and by placing it on Elisha, Elijah was marking him as his chosen successor. Elisha understood the significance immediately and responded with natural human concern for his family responsibilities. Verse 20 records his request. So he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, "Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." And he said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" Elisha wanted to say goodbye to his parents before leaving his old life behind forever. Elijah's response showed that this calling was a choice, not a forced command. He was essentially saying, "Think about what this means and decide for yourself." Elisha made his decision quickly and decisively. Verse 21 describes his dramatic farewell. Then Elisha turned back from him, and took a yoke of oxen and slaughtered them and boiled their flesh, using the oxen's equipment as fuel, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah, and became his servant. Elisha killed his oxen and burned his plowing equipment to cook the meat, then fed the entire community. This wasn't just a meal. It was a public declaration that he was leaving his old life permanently and completely by destroying his farming tools. He was making it impossible to return to his previous occupation. There would be no going back. Then he followed Elijah and became his servant, beginning his training for the prophetic ministry that would define the rest of his life. After Elisha left his family's farm to follow Elijah, the two prophets began a period of close companionship and intensive training that would last for several years. During this time, Elijah taught Elisha not just about the techniques of prophecy, but about the character and ways of God, the responsibilities of spiritual leadership, and the challenges of speaking God's truth in a hostile world. The Bible doesn't give us many details about these years of mentorship, but it's clear that Elisha learned not only from Elijah's words, but from watching his life and ministry up close. They traveled together throughout Israel, visiting the schools of prophets that existed in various cities, ministering to people's needs, and confronting the continuing problems of idolatry and injustice in the land. During this period, Elijah continued his prophetic ministry with renewed purpose and energy. He was no longer the discouraged man who had fled into the wilderness, but a prophet restored to confidence in God's plan and his own calling. Elisha served him faithfully, learning through experience what it meant to be God's spokesman in difficult times. The older prophet shared his wisdom about hearing God's voice, understanding his character, and maintaining faith when circumstances seemed impossible. Elisha also learned about the loneliness that often comes with prophetic ministry, the courage required to speak unpopular truths, and the supernatural power that God provides for those who trust him completely. Throughout these years, their relationship deepened from master and servant to something more like father and son. Elisha developed a deep love and respect for his mentor, while Elijah came to trust and depend on his faithful companion. They faced dangers together, witnessed miracles together, and shared the unique burden that comes with being responsible for delivering God's messages to a rebellious people. This wasn't just professional training. It was the formation of a spiritual father-son relationship that would culminate in one of the most dramatic transitions in biblical history. As the years passed, both men knew that their time together was limited and that God was preparing Elisha to carry on the prophetic ministry alone. The training was thorough, and the bond was strong, laying the foundation for what would happen when the time came for their final journey together. The day finally arrived when God revealed to Elijah that his earthly ministry was about to end in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Instead of dying a natural death like other men, he would be taken up alive into heaven. This knowledge was somehow communicated not only to Elijah but also to the groups of prophets who lived in various cities throughout Israel. 2 Kings 2 verse 1 sets the scene for this remarkable day. And it came to pass, when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. The journey began in Gilgal, a place that held special significance in Israel's history as the first camp after crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. From there, Elijah planned to visit several locations before his final departure, and Elisha was determined to accompany him every step of the way. Their first destination was Bethel, where a school of prophets was located. As they prepared to leave Gilgal, Elijah tried to convince Elisha to stay behind. Verse 2 records his attempt. Then Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. Elijah may have been trying to spare Elisha the pain of watching his departure, or perhaps he wanted to test his commitment one final time. But Elisha was absolutely determined not to be separated from his master, especially on this crucial day. When they arrived in Bethel, the local prophets immediately approached Elisha with a question that revealed their supernatural knowledge of what was about to happen. Verse 3 tells us, "Now the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, 'Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?' And he said, 'Yes, I know. Keep silent.'" These young prophets had received revelation about Elijah's coming departure, but their question was painful for Elisha to hear. He knew what was going to happen, but he didn't want to discuss it or think about losing the man who had become like a father to him. His response to keep silent showed both his knowledge of the situation and his emotional struggle with the reality of what was coming. The word was spreading among the prophetic communities that this was no ordinary day, but the day when one of Israel's greatest prophets would leave the earth in a way that had never happened before. From Bethel, Elijah and Elisha continued their journey to Jericho, where another group of prophets lived and ministered. Once again, Elijah tried to convince Elisha to remain behind, and once again, Elisha refused to be separated from his master. 2 Kings 2 verses 4 to 5 records this second attempt and the prophet's reaction. Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. Now the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho came to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" So he answered, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." The same scene repeated itself. The local prophets had received the same revelation about Elijah's departure, and Elisha gave the same response, acknowledging his knowledge, but asking them not to talk about it. The pain was too great for him to discuss openly. From Jericho, their final destination was the Jordan River, the same river that had been miraculously parted for Joshua and the Israelites when they first entered the Promised Land centuries earlier. When they reached the riverbank, 50 of the young prophets from Jericho followed them to watch what would happen. Verse 6 to 7 describes their arrival. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. For the third time Elijah tried to leave Elisha behind, and for the third time Elisha refused. The 50 prophets positioned themselves where they could witness whatever was about to happen, maintaining a respectful distance, but ensuring they could see this historic moment. Then Elijah performed a miracle that echoed the great works of Moses and Joshua. Verse 8 records this amazing event. Now Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, and it was divided this way and that, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Just as Moses had stretched out his rod to part the Red Sea, and Joshua had led the priests with the ark to part the Jordan, now Elijah struck the water with his prophet's mantle, and the river divided before them. The waters rolled back on both sides, creating a dry path across the riverbed. This miracle demonstrated that the same God who had worked through Moses and Joshua was still working through his prophets, and that Elijah carried the same divine authority that had been given to Israel's greatest leaders. The 50 watching prophets witnessed this incredible display of God's power, confirming that they were indeed watching the departure of a man who had walked closely with the Almighty throughout his ministry. Once they had crossed the Jordan River on dry ground, Elijah and Elisha found themselves alone on the other side, away from the watching eyes of the 50 prophets. It was here, in this private moment, that Elijah offered to grant Elisha one final request before his departure from the earth. 2 Kings 2 verse 9 records this touching conversation. And so it was, when they had crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask, what may I do for you, before I am taken away from you?" Elisha said, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." This was an extraordinary request that revealed the depth of Elisha's understanding of his calling and his complete dedication to continuing Elijah's work. He wasn't asking for wealth, fame, or personal comfort. He was asking for spiritual power, specifically, a double portion of the same spirit that had enabled Elijah to perform miracles, speak God's words with authority, and stand courageously against the forces of evil. In the culture of that time, the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's inheritance, twice as much as any other son. By asking for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, Elisha was essentially asking to be treated as Elijah's spiritual firstborn, his primary heir in the prophetic ministry. He understood that the challenges facing Israel were enormous and that he would need supernatural power beyond what any normal person possessed. Elijah's response showed both the significance of the request and the conditions that would determine whether it could be granted. Verse 10 records his reply. So he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so." Elijah couldn't grant this request by his own power. It was something that only God could give. But he could tell Elisha what the sign would be that God had honored his request. If Elisha was able to see Elijah's actual departure into heaven, it would indicate that God had granted him the spiritual sight and sensitivity necessary to receive the double portion he had requested. This wasn't just about physical eyesight, but about spiritual perception and readiness to receive the mantle of prophetic authority. The test would reveal whether Elisha had developed the spiritual maturity and divine calling necessary to carry forward Elijah's ministry with even greater power than his master had demonstrated. As Elijah and Elisha walked and talked together, both men knowing that their time was running out, the most spectacular event in either of their lives was about to unfold before their eyes. 2 Kings 2 verse 11 describes what happened next. As their conversation continued, an extraordinary event unfolded. Suddenly, a chariot of fire materialized, pulled by horses of fire, and it separated Elijah and Elisha. Elijah was then swept up into heaven by a whirlwind. There was no gradual build-up, no prelude. Without the slightest warning, the sky erupted in a blaze of supernatural light. A chariot, constructed entirely of fire, appeared as if from nowhere, drawn by horses that shimmered and pulsed with living flame. This wasn't the destructive fire that consumes and devastates. This was a celestial fire, radiating the very glory and power of God. The suddenness and intensity of the apparition were overwhelming. It instantly created a divide between the two prophets, a divine barrier that neither could cross. This chariot of fire was God's personal transportation, sent with the specific purpose of carrying his faithful servant, Elijah, home to heaven without him having to experience death. The horses that pulled this otherworldly vehicle were magnificent beyond description creatures composed of pure spiritual energy, existing solely to serve the will of the Almighty. Elisha stood transfixed, watching in utter amazement as this incredible spectacle unfolded before him. It was a sight that confirmed he was witnessing something truly unique, something no other human being had ever laid eyes on. The fire didn't harm Elijah. Instead, it enveloped him, lifted him gently, and carried him upward as the whirlwind took hold. This whirlwind was no ordinary destructive tornado. It was a controlled, divine wind, sent by God to carry his prophet up through the clouds and into the heavenly realm. As Elijah was caught up in this supernatural whirlwind, there was no struggle, no resistance. He simply yielded to God's power, allowing it to transport him from the earthly realm into the eternal presence of his Creator. The sight was so overwhelmingly powerful and emotionally charged that Elisha could barely contain his reaction. He had passed the test that Elijah had set before him. He had been granted the ability to witness his master's departure, which meant that God had, indeed, answered his request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This moment marked not only the end of one of the most remarkable lives in biblical history, but also the beginning of an even more powerful prophetic ministry through Elisha, who had proven himself worthy to carry on the work that his beloved master was leaving behind. As the chariot of fire and its fiery steeds carried Elijah upward into the heavens within the whirlwind, Elisha cried out with words that revealed both his deep love for his master and his profound recognition of Elijah's crucial importance to Israel's spiritual and military strength. The book of 2 Kings, chapter 2, verse 12, records his heartfelt emotional response. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." As Elijah vanished from sight, Elisha, overcome with emotion, tore his own clothes in two. Elisha's words, my father, spoke of the deep, father-son relationship that had blossomed between them over years of training and companionship. But his exclamation, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen, acknowledged that Elijah's worth to Israel's defense far surpassed that of any army, no matter how well equipped. One faithful prophet of God was more valuable for the nation's protection than all their military might combined, because God's power, working through his servant, was infinitely greater than any human force. When Elijah finally disappeared completely, taken up entirely into heaven, Elisha tore his clothes in grief, following the ancient custom of mourning. But his grief was mingled with wonder at the extraordinary sight he had just witnessed, and with anticipation for what God would accomplish through him in the days that lay ahead. The proof that he had, indeed, received the double portion he had requested came almost immediately, in the form of a tangible physical sign. Verse 13 tells us what happened next. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. During Elijah's ascension, his prophetic mantle had fallen from him, back to earth, landing where Elisha could retrieve it. This wasn't a random occurrence or an accident. It was God's deliberate way of transferring the authority and calling from one prophet to the next. The mantle symbolized the prophetic office and the power that came with it. Now it belonged to Elisha, officially marking him as Elijah's successor. To confirm that the power had truly been transferred, Elisha immediately put the mantle to the test. Verse 14 describes his first miracle as the newly appointed prophet. Then he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water and said, "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" And when he also had struck the water, it was divided this way and that, and Elisha crossed over. Elisha now used the same mantle to perform the very same miracle that Elijah had performed earlier that day. The waters parted before him, allowing him to cross back to where the 50 prophets were waiting and watching with bated breath. This miracle proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that God's power now rested upon Elisha, and that he was, without question, Elijah's legitimate successor. When the young prophets saw him crossing the river on dry ground, they immediately recognized what had happened. Verse 15 records their response. Now when the sons of the prophets who were from Jericho saw him at a distance, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." And they came to meet him and bowed down to the ground before him. They acknowledged Elisha as their new leader, showing him the same respect and deference they had previously shown to Elijah. If this story has resonated with you and strengthened your faith, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. These ancient accounts are not merely historical narratives. They are living testimonies of God's enduring power and unwavering love, capable of transforming your life today. Please consider sharing this video with your family, friends, and anyone who might need a reminder that our God is still the God of miracles. Your simple act of sharing could be exactly what someone needs to hear at this very moment. Together, let's spread these powerful stories of faith and hope to every corner of the world. What story would you like to hear next? Leave your suggestions in the comments section below. And don't ever forget that the same God who took Elijah to heaven in a chariot of fire is watching over you right now, offering his guidance, protection, and unwavering love.